Mr. Jefferson and the Giant Moose. It's a title that rings kind of like a fable, but the story is very real. Take us through a thumbnail. What's this book about?
It's about an amazing argument that Thomas Jefferson got into with the leading scientist in Europe at the time, a fellow named Count Buffon, who had written a huge encyclopedia of natural history. And in there, he claimed that all life in the New World, particularly America, was degenerate, weak, small, feeble, compared to life in the Old World. He talked about that with respect to all the animals. He talked about it with respect to the American Indians, and then some of his followers took this up and claimed it was true for anybody who moved to America. And the book is about Jefferson's response to this, why it infuriated him so much, and why he felt an obsession to prove Buffon wrong, and why the other founders became immersed in this, and how it made its way into 100 years of history in literature, philosophy, poetry, everything you can imagine. It was a huge argument that's sort of been lost to time.
America was essentially in its infancy during the latter stages of the Age of Enlightenment. How prevalent was this old world notion of North America, or America, as a substandard environment that would produce only degenerate life forms?
Buffon, who put the idea out initially, his 40-volume History of Natural Encyclopedia was arguably the best-selling book in Europe. It was translated into 12 languages, at least went through 40 editions. This was the talk of the salons in Europe. This was something that really mattered to people in both the Old World in Europe and in the New World.
And what was Jefferson, and our founders for that matter, what were they up against, and how did he see this playing out if he didn't take some extreme action?
Well, what they were up against was the leading scientists in the world proposing a scientific argument for why America was degenerate. First of all, this was counter to the basic notion that anybody could rise to any level in America. More than that, though, they were quite worried about the economic concerns, because if this idea took hold, then why would anybody leave Europe, and particularly why would they take their money and leave Europe and come to live in the New World?
Enter the Moose. It's a chapter title in your book, but so much more. You wrote that the hunt for the moose is the, quote, stuff of movies.
What Jefferson decided to do to disprove Buffon once and for all was to get a gigantic moose that he would have shipped over to him when he was in Paris. And he would take this stuffed moose and hand it to Buffon and say, see how wrong you were about degeneracy. And what happened was he got one of his old Revolutionary War friends, John Sullivan. Sullivan hired a team of 20 people who went out into the freezing winter of New Hampshire, bagged the moose for him, dragged it back to Sullivan's house. They stuff it. They get it ready to send to Jefferson. They bring it down to the dock. There's a whole story of the moose getting lost and not making over to Jefferson in Paris. But in fact, Jefferson's in tears because he thinks the moose is lost forever. And in fact, there's another moose that Sullivan has gotten that he's now sent over as well. And Jefferson gets this gigantic stuffed moose, sends it over to Buffon, and tells him, see, I told you degeneracy was ridiculous. Now you can see it for your own eyes.
How did this great debate between Jefferson and Buffon play out in the development of our national identity?
This notion of America as a land of mighty rivers and giant mountains, of hardworking people, bountiful crops, all of that developed in response to countering the degeneracy argument, but then it took off on its own and emerged as a national identity. So we can actually tie back our national identity to the degeneracy argument from the late 1700s.
Dr. Lee Dugatkin, professor of biology at the University of Louisville and author of the new book, Mr. Jefferson and the Giant Moose, thanks so much for talking with me today.
It was my pleasure.